There are moments in history when a single death reshapes the destiny of nations, and the spring of 1502 was one of them. Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, heir to the English throne, died at Ludlow Castle at the age of 15. He had been married only months earlier to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess whose union with Arthur was meant to anchor England's place among the great powers of Europe. The cause of death was likely sweating sickness, a brutal epidemic that swept through the Welsh marches that season, killing without warning or mercy. Arthur's death left his father, Henry VII, devastated, and his younger brother, Henry, suddenly thrust into a role he had never been prepared to occupy. The boy who had been destined for the church, who had spent his childhood in the shadow of his elder brother's careful grooming for kingship, was now the sole male heir to the Tudor dynasty. Everything changed in that moment, though no one could have known just how profoundly. Henry Tudor, the younger son, had grown up in a world of privilege and expectation, but not the expectation of ruling. He was educated in theology, philosophy, and the arts. He learned Latin, French, and Spanish. He studied music and became an accomplished composer and performer on multiple instruments. He was athletic, handsome, and charismatic, the kind of prince who could dazzle a court but who was never meant to bear the weight of a crown. His father kept him close, sheltered him, and rarely allowed him the kind of autonomy or political training that Arthur had received. The elder Henry, the first Tudor king, had won his throne on the battlefield at Bosworth and spent his entire reign obsessively securing his dynasty against pretenders and rival claimants. He was a careful, calculating man who trusted no one and hoarded power like a miser hoards gold. When Arthur died, Henry VII did not suddenly open the doors of statecraft to his remaining son. Instead, he tightened his grip, became more paranoid, and kept the young prince isolated, as if afraid that giving him too much freedom might somehow invite disaster. When Henry VII died in 1509, his son ascended the throne as Henry VIII at the age of 17. England had not seen a succession this smooth, this hopeful, in living memory. The realm erupted in celebration. Here was a king who embodied every ideal of Renaissance monarchy: tall, athletic, handsome, educated, a poet and musician, a champion in the jousting lists, a man who could speak with diplomats in their own languages and compose a ballad that would be sung in the taverns by nightfall. The contrast with his father could not have been sharper. Henry VII had been dour, suspicious, and obsessed with financial security to the point of miserliness. His son spent lavishly, hosted tournaments that lasted for days, and filled the court with laughter, music, and pageantry. Within weeks of his coronation, Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, in a ceremony that was both a romantic gesture and a calculated political move to preserve the Spanish alliance. The Pope had granted a dispensation allowing the marriage, and the young king seemed genuinely devoted to his new queen. She was older, composed, deeply pious, and politically astute. For a time, they were happy. The early years of Henry's reign were marked by an almost intoxicating sense of possibility. He surrounded himself with young, ambitious men who shared his love of spectacle and glory. He launched military campaigns in France, seeking to reclaim English territories lost in previous generations and to prove himself as a warrior king in the mold of Henry V. The results were mixed, some minor victories, some embarrassing failures, but the pageantry of war thrilled him. He hosted the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520, a summit meeting with Francis I of France that was less a diplomatic negotiation than a contest of magnificence, with both kings trying to outdo each other in displays of wealth, fashion, and chivalry. Henry wrestled Francis personally, lost, and sulked for days. It was a small moment, but it revealed something essential about the young king. He could not bear to be bested, even in play. He needed to be the center of every room, the victor of every contest, the author of every triumph. His sense of self was bound up entirely in his ability to dominate, to shine, to be seen as exceptional. But beneath the golden surface, something more troubling was taking shape. Henry had been given absolute power without ever being taught to share it. His father had ruled through fear and control, but he had at least understood the necessity of counsel, of balancing factions, of listening even when he did not agree. Henry VIII had no such training. He had been sheltered, then suddenly elevated, and he interpreted his kingship as a divine mandate that required no justification or compromise. He believed, with a sincerity that bordered on the mystical, that his will and God's will were aligned. When he wanted something, it was not merely a personal desire, it was a reflection of divine purpose. This belief would become the organizing principle of his reign, the lens through which every decision was filtered, and the justification for every betrayal, every execution, every act of cruelty that followed. In those early years, when the court was still dazzled by his charm and energy, when Catherine was still young enough to hope for sons, when the realm still believed in the promise of the Golden Prince, the seeds of paranoia were already germinating. Henry had inherited a throne he was never trained to occupy, and he would spend the next 4 decades destroying anyone who reminded him of that fact, anyone who seemed too powerful, too independent, too capable of existing outside his control. He would become a king who could not tolerate proximity, who saw intimacy as a threat, and who believed that loyalty was only proven through absolute submission. The Golden Prince who had once charmed all of Europe would become the architect of his own isolation, and the cost would be measured in the bodies of those who had served him best. Thomas Wolsey came from nothing, and that was precisely what made him dangerous. He was born around 1473 in Ipswich, the son of a butcher and cattle dealer, a man who worked with his hands and smelled of blood and market dust. In the rigid hierarchy of Tudor England, where birth determined destiny and noble blood opened every door, Wolsey had no claim to power, no inheritance, no family name that commanded respect. What he had was an intellect so sharp it could cut through the pretensions of men born to privilege, and an appetite for work that never seemed to exhaust itself. He studied at Oxford, was ordained as a priest, and entered royal service under Henry VII, where he quickly distinguished himself as a man who could solve problems that left other advisors paralyzed. When the young Henry VIII took the throne in 1509, Wolsey saw an opportunity. The new king was brilliant but impatient, charismatic but easily bored, hungry for glory but uninterested in the grinding details of governance. Wolsey understood immediately what the king needed, someone who could make his visions reality without troubling him with the mechanics of how it was done. Within a few years, Wolsey had become indispensable. He was appointed royal almoner, then Bishop of Lincoln, then Archbishop of York. In 1515, Henry made him Lord Chancellor, the highest legal office in the realm, and Pope Leo X elevated him to cardinal, cloaking him in the red robes that symbolized both ecclesiastical authority and proximity to Rome. But titles alone do not explain the extent of Wolsey's power. He controlled the courts, restructuring the legal system to make justice faster and more accessible, which won him the gratitude of commoners and the resentment of nobles who had grown accustomed to manipulating the law for their own benefit. He managed the treasury, extracting taxes and loans with a ruthlessness that kept the royal coffers full even as Henry spent lavishly on wars, palaces, and tournaments. He dominated foreign policy, negotiating treaties, forming alliances, and positioning England as a broker between the great powers of France and the Holy Roman Empire. He ran the Privy Council, sidelining rivals and ensuring that every major decision passed through his hands before reaching the king. Wolsey lived like a monarch. He built Hampton Court Palace, a sprawling architectural masterpiece on the Thames that rivaled anything Henry owned. Its grounds stretched across hundreds of acres, its halls were filled with tapestries and plate worth fortunes, and its kitchens could serve banquets for hundreds. When Wolsey traveled, he did so with a retinue that included nobles, priests, servants, and armed guards, processing through the countryside with a pomp that made onlookers wonder who, exactly, was the king and who was the servant. He wore silk and fur, slept in beds hung with cloth of gold, and dined on meals prepared by dozens of cooks. The nobles despised him for his origins, his arrogance, and his power. The people saw him as grasping and corrupt. But none of that mattered as long as Henry trusted him, and for nearly 2 decades, Henry trusted him absolutely. Wolsey delivered what the king wanted: military campaigns, diplomatic triumphs, cultural prestige, and the satisfaction of knowing that England mattered on the European stage. The partnership worked because Wolsey was willing to absorb the hatred and envy of everyone else at court as long as the king remained pleased. Then came the great matter, and everything collapsed. By the mid-1520s, Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon had become a source of deepening frustration and anxiety. Catherine had given birth multiple times, but only one child survived: Mary, a daughter. Henry needed a male heir. He believed, with a conviction that grew into obsession, that his lack of sons was a divine punishment for marrying his brother's widow, despite the papal dispensation that had made the union possible. He convinced himself that the marriage was cursed, that God was withholding his blessing, and that the only solution was annulment. He was also desperately, recklessly infatuated with Anne Boleyn, a sharp-tongued and ambitious young woman at court who refused to become his mistress and demanded marriage instead. Henry wanted Wolsey to fix it. He wanted the Pope to declare the marriage invalid, to set him free, to allow him to remarry and secure the succession. It seemed like the kind of problem Wolsey had solved 100 times before, a matter of negotiation, persuasion, pressure, and papal politics. But this time, the pieces would not move. Pope Clement VII was not a free agent. In 1527, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was also Catherine of Aragon's nephew, had sacked Rome, and the Pope was effectively his prisoner. Charles would not tolerate an annulment that humiliated his aunt and bastardized his cousin. Clement stalled, delayed, and equivocated, issuing commissions and hearings that went nowhere. Wolsey worked tirelessly, traveling to France, negotiating with cardinals, trying every diplomatic maneuver he knew, but the Pope would not budge. The months turned into years. And Boleyn, waiting and furious, blamed Wolsey for the delays. The conservative faction at court, led by the Duke of Norfolk and other nobles who had always loathed the cardinal, whispered that Wolsey was deliberately sabotaging the annulment to preserve his own power. Henry, who had never encountered a problem that Wolsey could not solve, began to doubt. The man who had built his entire career on delivering results was failing at the one task that mattered most to the king. In 1529, the facade crumbled. Wolsey was stripped of the office of Lord Chancellor and charged with praemunire, a legal offense related to asserting papal authority over royal jurisdiction. It was a technical accusation, but the message was clear: Wolsey had fallen, and he would not be allowed to rise again. He surrendered Hampton Court to the king, along with York Place and most of his wealth, in a desperate attempt to buy forgiveness. For a time, Henry seemed inclined to let him live quietly in disgrace. Wolsey retreated to York, the archdiocese he had held for years but never actually visited, and tried to rebuild some semblance of a life. But his enemies were not finished. In November 1530, he was arrested on charges of treason and ordered to return to London to face trial. He never made it. Traveling south under guard, broken in body and spirit, Wolsey died at Leicester Abbey, reportedly saying, "If I had served God as diligently as I have done the king, he would not have given me over in my gray hairs." It was a line that would echo through history, a bitter epitaph for a man who had built an empire within the kingdom and learned, too late, that proximity to absolute power is the most fragile position of all. Thomas Wolsey's death in 1530 created a vacuum at the center of English government, and into that void stepped a man unlike any advisor Henry had employed before. Thomas Cromwell was the son of a Putney brewer and blacksmith, a man whose early life read like a picaresque adventure. Soldier of fortune in Italy, cloth merchant in the Netherlands, moneylender, legal clerk, and eventually a lawyer who specialized in the messy business of estate management and commercial disputes. He had none of Wolsey's ecclesiastical grandeur, none of his taste for spectacle or his need to be seen as magnificent. Cromwell was practical, ruthless, and possessed of a mind that worked like a machine, always calculating, always 3 moves ahead. He had served Wolsey during the cardinal's final years, managing the dissolution of several small monasteries to fund Wolsey's educational projects, and he had learned from his master's downfall. Wolsey had failed because he could not deliver what the king wanted. Cromwell would not make the same mistake. He understood that Henry's frustration with Rome was not merely about the annulment, it was about authority, control, and the fundamental question of who held power in England. Cromwell saw an opportunity not just to solve the king's marital problem, but to reshape the entire structure of English governance. The solution Cromwell proposed was radical, almost unthinkable by the standards of Christendom. For 1,000 years, England had been part of the Universal Catholic Church, subject to papal authority in spiritual matters, sending taxes to Rome, accepting papal decrees, operating within a framework where kings and popes negotiated as partners in God's earthly order. Cromwell suggested breaking that framework entirely. He proposed that Henry declare himself supreme head of the Church in England, severing all ties with Rome, claiming for the crown the authority to determine doctrine, appoint bishops, and control the vast wealth held by the Church within the realm. It was not merely a divorce from Catherine, it was a divorce from Rome itself, a revolution disguised as a legal reform. Henry, who had always believed his will and God's will were aligned, found the idea intoxicating. If the Pope would not grant him what he needed, then the Pope's authority was illegitimate. If Rome stood in his way, then Rome had no place in England. Cromwell gave Henry not just a solution, but a theological justification for his own omnipotence. The mechanics of the break unfolded between 1532 and 1536 with a precision that revealed Cromwell's genius for bureaucratic warfare. He began by managing Parliament, a body that had traditionally been summoned only when the crown needed money and dismissed as soon as taxes were voted. Cromwell transformed it into a legislative engine, passing a series of acts that systematically dismantled papal authority. The Act in Restraint of Appeals, passed in 1533, declared that England was an empire unto itself, subject to no foreign power, effectively cutting off Catherine's ability to appeal her case to Rome. The Act of Supremacy, passed in 1534, made explicit what had been implied. The king was the supreme head of the Church of England, and to deny this was treason. The Treason Act of the same year expanded the definition of treason to include spoken words, not just actions, making it a capital crime to question the king's authority in any form. Cromwell understood that revolutions are built on paperwork, that power flows through legal channels, and that if you control the machinery of law, you control everything. But Cromwell was not merely a theorist. He was also an enforcer. He built a network of informants and agents who reported back to him on the words and actions of clergy, nobles, and commoners. He established the Court of Augmentations to manage the wealth that would soon flood into the crown's hands. He orchestrated interrogations, drafted indictments, and ensured that those who resisted the new order faced swift and public consequences. Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor and one of the most respected intellectuals in Europe, refused to swear the oath of supremacy. Cromwell had him arrested, tried, and executed in 1535. John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, met the same fate. The Carthusian monks who would not accept Henry as head of the church were hanged, drawn, and quartered, their bodies displayed as warnings. Cromwell did not take pleasure in cruelty, but he did not flinch from it either. He understood that fear was a tool, and that a revolution imposed from above required examples to be made of those who clung to the old order. The dissolution of the monasteries, which began in earnest in 1536, was the culmination of Cromwell's vision. Monasteries had existed in England for centuries, centers of learning, charity, and spiritual life, but they also held enormous wealth: land, gold, jewels, and the income from rents and tithes. Cromwell commissioned surveys to catalogue the wealth, sent agents to investigate allegations of corruption and immorality, and then moved methodically to shut them down. The smaller houses went first, their assets seized and transferred to the crown. The larger abbeys followed. By the end of the decade, hundreds of religious houses had been dissolved, their buildings stripped and sold, their lands redistributed to loyal nobles and gentry who now had a vested interest in ensuring the break with Rome remained permanent. The dissolution was justified as a moral reform, a purging of corruption and superstition, but it was fundamentally an act of state-building. Cromwell enriched the crown, rewarded Henry's supporters, and destroyed the institutional independence of the Church in a single, coordinated campaign. The relationship between Henry and Cromwell was nothing like the relationship between Henry and Wolsey. Wolsey had sought the king's affection, had craved approval and recognition, had wanted to be loved as well as obeyed. Cromwell wanted none of that. He was content to be useful, to be the man who made things happen, to operate in the background while Henry basked in the glory. He never built palaces or lived ostentatiously. He accumulated wealth, certainly, but he spent it on building a network of dependents and clients who owed their positions to him. He was efficient, disciplined, and seemingly tireless, capable of managing a dozen crises simultaneously without losing his focus. For nearly a decade, he was the engine that drove the English Reformation, the architect of a new kind of state where royal authority was absolute and dissent was treason. But Cromwell, like Wolsey before him, would eventually learn that proximity to Henry was a position that could not be held indefinitely. The machinery he had built to crush the king's enemies could just as easily be turned against him, and the legal framework he had constructed to eliminate opposition recognized no distinction between traitor and servant. For now, in the mid-1530s, Cromwell was indispensable, the first architect of the break, the man who had given Henry everything he wanted. But the king's gratitude was never a guarantee of survival. Anne Boleyn had waited 7 years to become queen, and she would have less than 3 years to keep the crown. She was not conventionally beautiful by the standards of the Tudor court, not the pale, soft, doe-eyed ideal that men claimed to admire. She was dark-haired, sharp-featured, with black eyes that glittered with intelligence and a wit that could cut through pretense with a single sentence. She had been educated in France, at the glittering court of Francis I, where women were expected to be clever, charming, and capable of holding their own in political conversation. When she returned to England in the early 1520s, she brought with her a sophistication that made her magnetic and dangerous in equal measure. Henry had pursued her with an obsession that bordered on madness, writing love letters, composing songs, promising her the world if she would only yield. But and understood something fundamental about power. The moment she gave him what he wanted, she would lose the only leverage she possessed. She refused to become his mistress. She demanded marriage, or nothing. And Henry, who had broken with Rome, defied the Pope, and torn apart the religious fabric of England to have her, finally got what he wanted in January 1533, when they were secretly married while she was already pregnant. The pregnancy was supposed to be the triumph that justified everything. Henry was certain the child would be a boy, the son he needed to secure the Tudor succession and prove that God had blessed his new marriage. Astrologers and physicians assured him, and herself believed it. When the child was born in September 1533, and it was a girl, the disappointment was crushing. They named her Elizabeth, and Henry tried to put on a brave face, but something had already shifted, and had promised him a son, had staked her entire claim to queenship on her ability to deliver what Catherine could not, and she had failed. She became pregnant again, and miscarried. She became pregnant a third time, and in January 1536, on the day Catherine of Aragon was buried, and miscarried a male child. The timing was grotesque, almost symbolic, as if God himself were mocking Henry's choices. The king had already begun to drift. There was a new woman at court, Jane Seymour, pale and meek and everything and was not, and Henry was paying her attention in ways that Anne recognized all too well. She had won him through calculated refusal. Now she watched as he pursued another, using the same tactics she had once employed against Catherine. Anne's fall was swift, brutal, and almost certainly orchestrated. In late April 1536, she was arrested and taken to the Tower of London on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The accusations were specific and lurid. She had slept with 5 men, including her own brother George, she had mocked the king, she had conspired to murder him, she had poisoned Catherine of Aragon. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, the product of a court conspiracy led by Thomas Cromwell, who had decided that and had become a liability. She had made enemies among the conservative nobility, had pushed religious reforms too far too fast, and most damningly, had failed to produce a male heir. The evidence was extracted through interrogation and torture, the testimonies vague and contradictory, but the outcome was never in doubt. The 5 men accused alongside her were tried and executed first, and was tried separately, defended herself with eloquence and fury, and was found guilty by a court that included her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. She was beheaded on May 19, 1536, by a swordsman brought from France because Henry, in a final gesture that might have been mercy or merely vanity, wanted her death to be clean and quick. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour in a quiet ceremony. The speed of it was obscene, a demonstration that queens were interchangeable, that the throne's needs superseded any pretense of grief or decency. Jane Seymour gave Henry what and could not, a son. Edward was born in October 1537, after a difficult labor that left Jane weak and feverish. She died 12 days later, probably from puerperal fever, an infection that killed countless women in childbirth. Henry mourned her genuinely, or at least convinced himself that he did. She became, in his memory, the perfect wife, the one who had given him his heir and asked nothing in return. He would be buried beside her when his own time came. But Jane's death did not slow the machinery of marriage and succession. Henry needed more sons, needed backups, needed to ensure the dynasty. Anne of Cleves arrived in 1540, a political bride chosen to cement an alliance with the Protestant German states. Henry found her physically repulsive, called her a Flanders mare, and had the marriage annulled after 6 months on the grounds of non-consummation. Anne, who was pragmatic and shrewd, accepted the annulment without protest, received a generous settlement, and lived comfortably in England for the rest of her life. She survived because she did not fight, did not demand, and did not threaten the king's ego. Catherine Howard was not so wise. She was young, perhaps 19 when Henry married her in 1540, a cousin of Anne Boleyn and a pawn of the conservative Howard faction at court. Henry, now obese and increasingly immobile, his leg wounds suppurating and his temper darkening, convinced himself he was in love again. Catherine was vivacious and flirtatious, and she made the aging king feel young. But she was also reckless. She had relationships before the marriage that she failed to disclose, and worse, she may have continued a relationship with Thomas Culpeper, a member of the king's privy chamber, after becoming queen. In November 1541, evidence of her indiscretions reached the king. Henry wept, raged, and called for a sword so he could kill her himself. The investigation was thorough and merciless. Catherine and Culpeper were both executed in February 1542, along with several others implicated in the scandal. Catherine went to the block still in her teens, another woman destroyed by proximity to a king who demanded perfection and punished failure with death. Catherine Parr, the 6th and final wife, married Henry in 1543 when he was 52, sick, and nearing the end. She was a widow twice over, intelligent, educated, and skilled at managing difficult men. She nursed Henry through his final years, navigated the treacherous waters of court politics, and survived an attempt by conservative bishops to have her arrested for heresy by abasing herself before the king and assuring him she had only debated theology to distract him from his pain. She outlived him by a year, dying in childbirth after remarrying. Of the 6 women Henry married, 3 were discarded, 2 were executed, and 1 died in childbirth, giving him the son he had demanded. The succession had been secured, but the cost was measured in the bodies of women who had been used, consumed, and destroyed by a king who saw them not as partners but as instruments of dynastic survival. Henry had learned that wives, like advisors, were replaceable, and that failure to deliver what he needed was a crime punishable by death. Thomas Cromwell had survived in Henry's service longer than any man had a right to expect, and he had done so through a combination of ruthless efficiency and an almost preternatural ability to anticipate what the king needed before Henry himself fully understood it. By 1540, Cromwell had been the chief architect of the English Reformation, the mastermind behind the break with Rome, the orchestrator of the dissolution of the monasteries, and the builder of an administrative machinery that had transformed England into something resembling a modern state. He had enriched the crown beyond measure, eliminated the king's enemies with surgical precision, and accumulated more power than any minister since Wolsey. But unlike Wolsey, who had craved magnificence and lived like a prince of the church, Cromwell operated with a bureaucrat's cold discipline. He dressed modestly, lived comfortably but not ostentatiously, and spent his wealth building networks of clients and dependents who owed their positions entirely to him. He was the spider at the center of the web, and for nearly a decade, that web had held. But webs are fragile things, and in 1540, Cromwell spun a thread that would strangle him. The marriage to Anne of Cleves had seemed, at the time, like a masterstroke of diplomatic strategy. England in 1539 was isolated and vulnerable. The break with Rome had made Henry a heretic in the eyes of Catholic Europe, and there was a real fear that the Pope might call for a crusade against England, with France and the Holy Roman Empire setting aside their rivalry long enough to invade. Cromwell needed allies, and he found them in the Protestant princes of Germany. The Duke of Cleves controlled territories along the Rhine, strategically positioned and religiously aligned with England's new reformed identity. A marriage alliance made perfect sense on paper. It would bind England to the German Protestant League, provide a counterweight to Catholic power, and give Henry a new queen who could perhaps provide more sons. Cromwell negotiated the terms, arranged for a portrait of Anne to be sent to England, and assured Henry that the match was both politically necessary and personally agreeable. The portrait, painted by Hans Holbein, showed a woman who was dignified, pleasant-featured, and appropriately royal. Henry, eager to remarry after Jane Seymour's death and intrigued by the prospect of a young bride, gave his consent. Anne of Cleves arrived in England at the end of December 1539, and the moment Henry met her, the entire strategy collapsed. He found her physically unattractive, later describing her in terms that were crude and humiliating. He complained that she did not resemble her portrait, that her skin was marked, that she had an unpleasant smell, that she lacked the grace and charm he expected in a queen. The criticism was partly aesthetic and partly cultural, and had been raised in a more austere court than the glittering sophistication of Renaissance England, and she did not speak English, could not dance in the English style, and seemed bewildered by the elaborate rituals of Tudor courtship. Henry felt trapped and deceived. He had expected a bride who would enchant him, and instead he faced a woman who struck him as foreign, awkward, and entirely unsuitable. The marriage went ahead in January 1540, because to cancel it would have been an unbearable diplomatic humiliation, but Henry made his displeasure clear from the beginning. He consummated the marriage reluctantly, if at all, and within weeks was complaining to his physicians and counselors that he could not bring himself to fulfill his marital duties. Cromwell scrambled to salvage the situation, but there was no solution that would satisfy the king. Henry wanted out of the marriage, wanted the entire arrangement undone, and he blamed Cromwell entirely for pushing the alliance. It did not matter that the diplomatic logic had been sound, that the Protestant alliance had been necessary, or that Cromwell had acted in good faith based on the information available. Henry's personal humiliation overrode all strategic considerations, and once the king decided that a mistake had been made, someone had to pay for it. Cromwell's enemies at court saw their opportunity. The Duke of Norfolk and Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, led the conservative Catholic faction that had always loathed Cromwell for dismantling the monasteries and pushing religious reform. They whispered to the king that Cromwell had overreached, that he was enriching himself at the crown's expense, that he was pushing heretical doctrines, that he had effectively made himself more powerful than the king. They suggested that Cromwell had deliberately trapped Henry in a marriage to a Protestant princess to advance his own religious agenda, that he was manipulating the king for his own purposes, and that his ambitions had grown so vast that he represented a danger to the throne itself. In June 1540, Cromwell was arrested at a council meeting without warning. He was taken completely by surprise, seized by guards as he sat among men he had worked with for years, men who owed their careers to him. He was stripped of his offices, his estates were confiscated, and he was sent to the Tower. The charges were vague and contradictory: treason, heresy, corruption, and an assortment of accusations that would have been impossible for him to have committed given the scope of his duties and the king's oversight. He was not given a trial. Instead, Parliament passed an Act of Attainder, a legal instrument that declared him guilty without the need for evidence or defense. It was the same mechanism he had used against others, the same machinery of legislative execution that he had helped to perfect, now turned against him with brutal efficiency. Cromwell wrote desperate letters to Henry from his cell, pleading for mercy, protesting his loyalty, begging for a chance to defend himself. The king ignored them. On July 28, 1540, Cromwell was taken to Tower Hill and beheaded. The executioner was incompetent or nervous, and it took multiple blows to sever his head. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. Henry later admitted, in a moment of bitterness and regret, that he had been manipulated into killing the most faithful servant he ever had. He blamed his counselors for leading him astray, for feeding him false information, for taking advantage of his anger over the Anne of Cleves disaster. But the admission came too late and changed nothing. Cromwell's death demonstrated a truth that Wolsey's fall had only hinted at. No amount of service, no depth of loyalty, no record of success could protect anyone from the king's displeasure. Henry's trust was not a reward for competence. It was a temporary condition that could be revoked the moment something went wrong. Cromwell had built the machinery that allowed Henry to rule as an absolute monarch, had given him the legal and financial tools to destroy opposition and centralize power, and in the end, that machinery had consumed its creator. The minister who had orchestrated the fall of queens, bishops, and nobles had miscalculated the one thing he could not afford to get wrong: the king's vanity. And for that single error, built on diplomatic logic and strategic necessity, he paid with his life. There is a particular kind of loneliness that accompanies absolute power, and Henry VIII spent the latter half of his reign discovering its dimensions. He had begun as a king who surrounded himself with companions, men who jousted beside him, hunted with him, drank with him, and filled the court with laughter and masculine camaraderie. But as the years passed and the bodies accumulated, the definition of friendship changed. Proximity became dangerous. Competence became suspicious. Independence became intolerable. Henry learned to see threats everywhere, and the closer someone stood to the throne, the more threatening they appeared. The men who had once been his intimates found themselves navigating an impossible calculus: stay close enough to remain useful, but not so close that the king began to wonder whether their loyalty concealed ambition, whether their service masked a desire for power, whether their very existence represented a challenge to his supremacy. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, was perhaps the only man who understood this calculus well enough to survive it. He had been Henry's closest friend since childhood, a relationship built on genuine affection and shared passions. Brandon was everything Henry admired. Tall, athletic, a champion in the jousting lists, charming with women, and blessed with a kind of easy confidence that came from never having to prove himself. He was also reckless in ways that should have destroyed him. In 1515, he secretly married Henry's sister, Mary Tudor, the Dowager Queen of France, without the king's permission, a breach of protocol that could easily have been interpreted as treason. Henry was furious, but he forgave Brandon, extracted a massive fine, and allowed the marriage to stand. It was the kind of transgression that would have ended anyone else, but Brandon had something no one else possessed, the king's genuine love. He never accumulated too much independent power, never built a faction at court, never questioned Henry's decisions, and never allowed himself to appear as anything other than a loyal servant who happened to be the king's brother-in-law. He fought Henry's wars, managed his estates, and stayed silent during the religious upheavals that consumed others. He died in 1545, at the age of 60, having outlived nearly everyone else from Henry's youth. He survived because he understood that friendship with the king required absolute subordination, and because he died before Henry's paranoia could find a reason to turn on him. Thomas More had no such protection. He was one of the most brilliant men in Europe, a humanist scholar, author of Utopia, a lawyer of formidable intellect, and a man whose integrity was so widely respected that even his enemies acknowledged it. Henry had adored him, called him a friend, appointed him Lord Chancellor in 1529 after Wolsey's fall, and delighted in walking with him through the gardens of Chelsea, debating philosophy and theology for hours. More had never sought power. He accepted the chancellorship reluctantly, knowing it would place him at the center of the king's struggle with Rome, and he served with a scrupulousness that made him both admired and ineffective. When the break with Rome became inevitable, when Henry demanded that all subjects swear the oath of supremacy, acknowledging him as supreme head of the church, More could not do it. His conscience, formed by a lifetime of Catholic devotion and intellectual rigor, would not allow him to deny papal authority. He resigned the chancellorship in 1532 and retreated to private life, hoping that silence would be enough to protect him. It was not. More's refusal to swear the oath was interpreted as defiance, and defiance could not be tolerated. In 1534, he was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. For over a year, he remained there, writing letters to his daughter Margaret, enduring interrogations, and maintaining his silence. The government tried to break him through legal harassment, through threats to his family, through the spectacle of other men being executed for the same refusal. More watched from his cell as the Carthusian monks were dragged to Tyburn and butchered, their bodies carved apart while they were still alive, their heads mounted on pikes. He knew that fate awaited him, and he did not waver. In July 1535, he was tried on perjured testimony, found guilty of treason, and sentenced to death. Henry commuted the sentence from hanging, drawing, and quartering to simple beheading, a gesture of mercy that More acknowledged with grim humor. On the scaffold, he told the crowd he died the king's good servant, but God's first. His head was displayed on London Bridge for a month before his daughter bribed someone to retrieve it. More's execution was a message. Not even friendship, not even international renown, not even a lifetime of loyalty could save a man who placed his conscience above the king's will. The Duke of Buckingham, Edward Stafford, had been executed even earlier, in 1521, and his crime was nothing more than existing. He was the wealthiest nobleman in England, descended from Edward III through both his mother and father, and his royal blood made him, in theory, a potential claimant to the throne. He had no intention of challenging Henry, had served loyally in Parliament and at court, but he also had a temper, a sense of aristocratic entitlement, and a tendency to speak carelessly about the succession. He was heard saying that if Henry died without a male heir, the crown might return to the true Plantagenet line, meaning his own family. It was idle speculation, the kind of talk that happened in noble households all the time, but it reached the king's ears. Henry saw conspiracy where there was only vanity. Buckingham was arrested, tried before his peers, and executed on Tower Hill in May 1521. His death was a warning to the old nobility. Blood meant nothing if the king decided you were a threat. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, was executed in the final weeks of Henry's life, in January 1547, for the crime of quartering the royal arms on his coat of arms. Surrey was a poet, a soldier, and the son of the Duke of Norfolk, one of the most powerful men in England. He was also arrogant, hot-tempered, and careless in his displays of aristocratic pride. The quartered arms were interpreted as a claim to royal status, evidence of ambition, proof that Surrey saw himself as more than a subject. The charges were absurd, but Surrey had made enemies, and the king's paranoia was at its peak. He was tried, convicted, and beheaded at the age of 30. His father, the Duke of Norfolk, was condemned to die as well, the execution scheduled for the morning of January 28. Norfolk spent the night in the Tower expecting death, but Henry VIII died during those same dark hours, and the execution was never carried out. Norfolk survived because the king died first, a matter of hours that separated life from oblivion. These men, friends and allies, had learned what Wolsey and Cromwell and the queens had learned, that closeness to Henry was not a privilege but a condition of vulnerability, and that the king's affection was the most dangerous gift anyone could receive. By the mid-1530s, England had become a state where the law itself was weaponized, where words spoken in private could lead to execution, and where the machinery of justice served not to protect the innocent but to eliminate anyone the crown deemed dangerous. This was not the chaos of mob violence or the random cruelty of a tyrant's whim. It was something more deliberate, more systematic, more chilling in its efficiency. Henry VIII and his ministers, particularly Thomas Cromwell, had constructed a legal framework that transformed dissent into treason and made silence itself a form of guilt. The mechanism of terror was not built on arbitrary brutality. It was built on laws passed by Parliament, trials conducted in courts, and executions carried out with the full sanction of the judicial process. It was terror cloaked in legality, and that made it far more insidious than any dungeon torture or midnight assassination. The system worked because it convinced people that their destruction was lawful, that their deaths were justified, and that resistance was not just futile but morally wrong. The Act of Supremacy, passed in 1534, declared that the king was the supreme head of the Church of England, and that to deny this was to commit treason. The Treason Act, passed the same year, expanded the crime of treason beyond physical actions like raising arms against the crown or giving aid to enemies. Now treason included words, spoken words, written words, even malicious silence if it could be interpreted as refusal to affirm the king's supremacy. A man could be executed for saying the wrong thing in a tavern, for writing a letter that questioned royal policy, for refusing to take an oath, or for failing to report someone else who had spoken against the king. The law created an environment where everyone was potentially guilty, where every conversation carried risk, and where the safest course of action was to inform on others before they could inform on you. Cromwell understood the power of this system. He did not need to arrest everyone. He only needed to arrest enough people, visibly and brutally, to ensure that everyone else policed themselves. The enforcement network Cromwell built was vast and pervasive. Informants operated at every level of society, from noblemen at court to parish priests in rural villages. Some were motivated by ideology, true believers in the Reformation who saw it as their duty to root out Catholic sympathizers. Others were motivated by fear, knowing that failure to report suspicious activity could itself be construed as treason. Still others were motivated by ambition or greed, understanding that informing on a neighbor could result in rewards, preferment, or a share of confiscated property. The reports flowed upward through layers of bureaucracy, landing eventually on Cromwell's desk, where they were assessed, categorized, and acted upon. Not every accusation led to arrest, but enough did that the system maintained its credibility. People believed that speaking against the king would be discovered, that interrogations would follow, and that punishment would be swift and public. Interrogation was both an art and a science in Tudor England. The Tower of London held cells where prisoners could be kept for months or years, gradually worn down by isolation, uncertainty, and the knowledge that others were being questioned about them. Torture was legal under certain circumstances, particularly when the Crown believed that crucial information was being withheld or that a conspiracy needed to be uncovered. The rack stretched bodies until joints dislocated and confessions poured out. The scavenger's daughter compressed the body into a kneeling position until ribs cracked and blood ran from the nose and ears. These were not tools of sadism for its own sake. They were tools of statecraft, methods of extracting testimony that could then be used in court to build a case against others. The confessions obtained under torture were often unreliable, filled with whatever the prisoner thought the interrogators wanted to hear, but reliability was not the point. The point was to create a narrative of guilt, to construct a legal justification for execution, and to demonstrate that resistance was impossible. By the mid-1530s, England had become a state where the law itself was weaponized, where words spoken in private could lead to execution, and where the machinery of justice served not to protect the innocent but to eliminate anyone the Crown deemed dangerous. This was not the chaos of mob violence or the random cruelty of a tyrant's whim. It was something more deliberate, more systematic, more chilling in its efficiency. Henry VIII and his ministers, particularly Thomas Cromwell, had constructed a legal framework that transformed dissent into treason and made silence itself a form of guilt. The mechanism of terror was not built on arbitrary brutality. It was built on laws passed by Parliament, trials conducted in courts, and executions carried out with the full sanction of the judicial process. It was terror cloaked in legality, and that made it far more insidious than any dungeon torture or midnight assassination. The system worked because it convinced people that their destruction was lawful, that their deaths were justified, and that resistance was not just futile but morally wrong. The Act of Supremacy, passed in 1534, declared that the king was the supreme head of the Church of England, and that to deny this was to commit treason. The Treason Act, passed the same year, expanded the crime of treason beyond physical actions like raising arms against the crown or giving aid to enemies. Now treason included words, spoken words, written words, even malicious silence if it could be interpreted as refusal to affirm the king's supremacy. A man could be executed for saying the wrong thing in a tavern, for writing a letter that questioned royal policy, for refusing to take an oath, or for failing to report someone else who had spoken against the king. The law created an environment where everyone was potentially guilty, where every conversation carried risk, and where the safest course of action was to inform on others before they could inform on you. Cromwell understood the power of this system. He did not need to arrest everyone. He only needed to arrest enough people, visibly and brutally, to ensure that everyone else policed themselves. The enforcement network Cromwell built was vast and pervasive. Informants operated at every level of society, from noblemen at court to parish priests in rural villages. Some were motivated by ideology, true believers in the Reformation who saw it as their duty to root out Catholic sympathizers. Others were motivated by fear, knowing that failure to report suspicious activity could itself be construed as treason. Still others were motivated by ambition or greed, understanding that informing on a neighbor could result in rewards, preferment, or a share of confiscated property. The reports flowed upward through layers of bureaucracy, landing eventually on Cromwell's desk, where they were assessed, categorized, and acted upon. Not every accusation led to arrest, but enough did that the system maintained its credibility. People believed that speaking against the king would be discovered, that interrogations would follow, and that punishment would be swift and public. Interrogation was both an art and a science in Tudor England. The Tower of London held cells where prisoners could be kept for months or years, gradually worn down by isolation, uncertainty, and the knowledge that others were being questioned about them. Torture was legal under certain circumstances, particularly when the Crown believed that crucial information was being withheld or that a conspiracy needed to be uncovered. The rack stretched bodies until joints dislocated and confessions poured out. The scavenger's daughter compressed the body into a kneeling position until ribs cracked and blood ran from the nose and ears. These were not tools of sadism for its own sake. They were tools of statecraft, methods of extracting testimony that could then be used in court to build a case against others. The confessions obtained under torture were often unreliable, filled with whatever the prisoner thought the interrogators wanted to hear, but reliability was not the point. The point was to create a narrative of guilt, to construct a legal justification for execution, and to demonstrate that resistance was impossible. By the 1540s, Henry VIII had become a grotesque parody of the Golden Prince who had once dazzled Europe. The athletic young king who had jousted for hours and danced through the night was now so obese that he had to be moved by mechanical devices, hoisted by pulleys and carried by teams of servants. His waist measured over 50 inches, his legs were swollen and ulcerated, and the wound from a jousting accident in 1536 had never properly healed, festering and suppurating, filling the air around him with a smell of rotting flesh. He suffered from constant pain, could barely walk, and his temper, always volatile, had become genuinely terrifying. His physicians lived in fear of giving him bad news, knowing that kings did not forgive bearers of uncomfortable truths. His courtiers learned to read his moods by the sound of his footsteps, by the set of his jaw, by the way his small eyes tracked movement across the room. He was dying slowly, his body collapsing piece by piece, but his capacity for suspicion and cruelty remained as sharp as ever. The women in his life during these final years were footnotes to a reign that had already consumed 2 queens on the scaffold. Catherine Howard had been executed in 1542, her head severed on Tower Green for the crime of adultery, real or imagined, and Henry had wept with rage and self-pity, convinced that everyone around him was conspiring to humiliate him. Catherine Parr, who married him in 1543, survived through a combination of intelligence, submission, and sheer luck. She was a widow twice over, mature and educated, and she understood that her role was to be a nurse, not a lover, a companion, not a rival. She tended to his wounds, read to him, managed his children with tact, and navigated the poisonous politics of the court with care. In 1546, conservative bishops, led by Stephen Gardiner, attempted to have her arrested for heresy, accusing her of promoting Protestant theology too openly. The king signed the warrant, and only a desperate act of self-abasement saved her. Parr threw herself at Henry's feet, wept, and insisted that she had only debated theology to distract him from his pain, that she had no opinions of her own, that she existed only to learn from his wisdom. Henry, mollified or simply bored by the game, forgave her. She survived because she understood what others had not, that Henry demanded not just obedience, but the performance of absolute inferiority. The court around Henry in these years was a place of whispers and paranoia, where factions maneuvered for control of what would come after the king's death. Edward, the young prince, was sickly and only 9 years old in 1546. Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, was Catholic, bitter, and in her 30s. Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, was 13, brilliant, and politically astute beyond her years, but also tainted by her mother's execution and legally declared a bastard. The succession was fragile, and everyone at court knew it. The conservative Catholic faction, led by the Duke of Norfolk and Bishop Gardiner, wanted to steer the realm back toward Rome after Henry's death. The Protestant reformers, led by Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford and uncle to Prince Edward, wanted to push England further into Reformation. Henry, who had spent his entire reign demanding absolute loyalty, now presided over a court where every advisor was positioning themselves for a future without him, where every decision was made with an eye toward what would happen when the throne passed to a child. In this atmosphere of decay and intrigue, Henry struck one final time. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, was a poet of extraordinary talent, a soldier who had fought in Henry's wars, and the son of the Duke of Norfolk, the most powerful nobleman in England. Surrey was also arrogant, hot-tempered, and carelessly proud of his lineage. In late 1546, he made the fatal mistake of quartering the royal arms on his own coat of arms, a heraldic choice that was interpreted as a claim to royal status, as evidence that he saw himself as a potential heir or protector of the realm. The charge was absurd, but it was enough. Surrey was arrested, tried, and convicted of treason in January 1547. He was beheaded on Tower Hill at the age of 30, and his poetry, which would later be recognized as some of the finest in the English language, was barely known outside court circles. His father, the Duke of Norfolk, was arrested on the same charges and condemned to die. The execution was scheduled for January 28, 1547. Norfolk spent the night of January 27 in the Tower, writing his will, preparing himself for the morning. But during that same night, in the Palace of Whitehall, Henry VIII died. The king's death came in the early hours of January 28, and it was kept secret for several days while the reformist faction secured control of the government and ensured that Edward Seymour would become Lord Protector during young Edward's minority. When the death was finally announced, England learned that the man who had dominated their lives for 38 years, who had broken with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, executed 2 queens, destroyed countless nobles and ministers, and reshaped the entire religious and political landscape of the realm, was gone. The Duke of Norfolk's execution was quietly cancelled, and he remained imprisoned throughout Edward's reign, only to be released when Mary took the throne in 1553. He had survived Henry by mere hours, a lottery of timing that separated life from death. Henry's will, which should have been a clear statement of succession, was itself a source of controversy. It confirmed the order of succession as Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth, but it also included provisions for a regency council that was supposed to govern collectively during Edward's minority. The will was almost certainly altered after Henry's death, manipulated by those around him to concentrate power in Seymour's hands. The king who had spent his entire reign obsessed with control, who had built a legal and bureaucratic machinery designed to enforce his will absolutely, had lost control in the end. His death opened a power vacuum that would lead to religious civil war, rebellion, and the eventual execution of 2 of his children's successors. Henry VIII was buried at Windsor Castle beside Jane Seymour, the wife he had mourned most genuinely, the one who had given him his son and died before she could disappoint him. His tomb was never completed. The magnificent monument he had planned, which was supposed to rival anything built for previous kings, remained unfinished, a metaphor for a reign that had consumed everything and everyone around it without ever achieving the security and dynastic permanence he had sought. He left behind 3 children, 2 of whom were legally bastardized, a church torn between Catholic and Protestant factions, a nobility traumatized by decades of terror, and a kingdom that had learned to survive by never trusting anyone, especially those closest to power. The Golden Prince who had inherited everything had become the dying king who trusted no one, and in the end, his greatest legacy was not the church he had founded or the wealth he had seized, but the lesson he had taught through blood and fear, that proximity to absolute power is the most dangerous position in the world, and that even kings die alone.